You know how your doctor makes you wait 6 months just to try a slightly different allergy medication? Well, their ancestors were out here drilling holes in people's skulls with rocks, prescribing whale carcasses as hot tubs, and telling drowning victims that what they really needed was tobacco smoke blown up their backside. And they did all of this with the confidence of someone who just aced their medical boards. If you think modern medicine moves slowly, just be grateful they're not suggesting you climb inside a dead whale to fix your knee pain. Bleeding people until they felt better was apparently the answer to every single medical question for about 3,000 years. Ancient Egyptians were slicing open veins as early as 1000 BCE, and the Greeks and Romans thought this was such a brilliant idea they turned it into an entire medical philosophy. The theory was that your body contained 4 humors, which sounds lovely until you realize they meant blood, phlegm, and 2 different types of bile. Naturally, if you had a headache, epilepsy, or smallpox, the solution was obvious. Just remove some of the blood and hope the remaining humors sorted themselves out. This carried on through medieval times and peaked during the Renaissance, when the barber would cut your hair and then cheerfully open a vein as part of the service. That red and white pole outside barbershops? That's literally advertising the blood and bandages. Charmy. The practice only really died out when people finally noticed that draining sick people of blood wasn't exactly helping them recover. Leeches were the refined version of just hacking into someone with a blade, which tells you everything about medieval standards of refinement. From the 1200s through the 1800s, European doctors stuck leeches on patients for basically every ailment imaginable. Fever? Leeches. Mental illness? More leeches. The logic was identical to bloodletting, just with more wriggling involved. A French physician named Francois Broussais became so enthusiastic about leeches in the early 1800s that he prescribed them in absolutely staggering quantities. Patients would be covered in dozens of the things at once. Broussais was so successful at promoting his therapy that Europe nearly ran out of medicinal leeches entirely. They had to start importing them because demand was that high. The practice only fell out of favor when actual science finally turned up and suggested that maybe draining people's blood with parasitic worms wasn't the miracle cure everyone thought it was. Drilling holes in people's skulls turns out to be one of humanity's oldest hobbies. Trepanning, as it was formerly known, involves scraping or boring a neat hole directly into someone's head, and we've found evidence of this across prehistoric Europe, Africa, and South America. The reasoning was that evil spirits or dangerous pressures needed an exit route, so obviously the answer was power tools. Well, stone tools, but the principle holds. It was used for headaches, epilepsy, and mental illness, which must have been a truly horrible day for everyone involved. The shocking part is that some patients actually survived, because archaeologists have found skulls where the bone grew back around the hole, meaning the person lived long enough to heal. Ancient Greek doctors wrote about the procedure, and it stuck around all the way into the Renaissance. It's a perfect example of humanity looking at a complex problem and deciding that making a hole was definitely the solution. Mercury seemed like such a good idea to doctors from ancient Rome through the 1800s that they just kept prescribing it despite the fact that it was slowly destroying their patients. It was used mainly for skin diseases and syphilis, applied as ointments or inhaled as vapor and fumigation treatments. Physicians genuinely believed mercury could purge infections and impurities from the body, which technically it did, along with purging kidney function, neurological stability, and the ability to stop trembling. The side effects were severe and obvious, but medical understanding at the time was so limited that doctors just assumed that meant it was working. Mercury therapy remained completely mainstream until penicillin arrived in the 20th century and gave everyone a much less poisonous option. For centuries, though, apothecaries valued its supposed cleansing properties highly enough to keep recommending it, and patients kept taking it because their doctor said so. European apothecaries in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries sold ground-up mummy as medicine, and business was apparently quite good. Powdered mummy flesh, called mumia, was believed to have life-preserving or blood-restoring powers, so naturally people consumed it for pain relief, inflammation, and internal bleeding. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were buying imported Egyptian mummies from your local pharmacy. Demand got high enough that when Egyptian mummies became harder to source, Europeans just started making their own using locally obtained bodies prepared in imitation. The practice was genuinely popular among physicians and rich patients for about 2 centuries. It only stopped in the 1800s when medical science advanced enough for people to realize that eating dead strangers was perhaps not the health breakthrough they'd imagined. The unsanitary origins becoming widely known also helped kill the trend rather decisively. Blowing tobacco smoke directly into someone's backside was considered legitimate emergency medicine in 18th and early 19th century Europe. The idea was that drowning victims could be resuscitated if you administered warm tobacco smoke rectally using a bellows and a pipe, because apparently that seemed more logical than anything else available at the time. British physicians and the Royal Humane Society promoted this method enthusiastically, and emergency kits were stationed along the River Thames specifically for this purpose. The treatment wasn't just for drowning either. Doctors also recommended tobacco enemas for colds, colic, and cholera, because clearly if it worked for one thing, it must work for everything. The practice only declined when someone finally worked out that nicotine was actually toxic and pumping it into unconscious people might not be helping. It's genuinely impressive how long it took for that revelation to arrive. Late 19th century, Australia produced a folk remedy so strange that it barely sounds real, but coastal whaling towns swore by it. People suffering from rheumatism would crawl inside the carcass of a freshly deceased whale and just sit there for several hours. The belief was that the whale's warmth and vitality would transfer to the human body and cure joint pain and stiffness. You'd climb in, wait until the internal temperature dropped, then climb back out, presumably smelling absolutely unforgettable. Towns like Eden in New South Wales recorded this practice as a local curiosity, and while it was never formally medical, it gained brief regional fame as a natural cure. There's no evidence it actually worked, but there's plenty of evidence that people were genuinely desperate enough to try it. It remains one of the more visceral examples of folk medicine taking things to an extreme conclusion. Ancient Romans had a straightforward approach to acquiring strength and vitality. Consume the blood of someone who clearly had both. Gladiators fit the bill perfectly, so spectators and some physicians believed that drinking their freshly collected blood could cure epilepsy or general weakness. Contemporary Roman writings mention that blood was sometimes sold near the arenas specifically for this purpose, which suggests the practice was common enough to have a market. The logic combined Roman ideas about physical vigor with the energy of the warrior class, and apparently nobody questioned whether this was a reasonable medical intervention. To modern sensibilities, it's deeply disturbing, but to Romans, it made perfect sense that blood carried life force and you could just transfer it by drinking it. It reflected how seriously they took the connection between bodily fluids and health, even if the execution was absolutely grim. Injecting cow's milk directly into people's veins seemed like innovation when physicians tried it in the late 1800s. Blood transfusions were poorly understood at the time, and frequently fatal because blood types weren't known yet, so doctors started experimenting with alternatives. Milk was white, organic, and nutritious, so the reasoning went that it could nourish patients directly through the bloodstream. American and European doctors tried it on anemic and malnourished people, fully expecting it to work. It did not work. The experiments were dangerous, ineffective, and quickly abandoned by the early 1900s once it became clear that milk and blood are not interchangeable fluids. It's a perfect example of medical logic that sounds almost reasonable until you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Cigarette companies in the early 20th century convinced people that smoking was actually good for you, and they got doctors to help. Advertisements in the 1930s and 1940s claimed that certain brands soothed coughs, cleared lungs, and helped with throat irritation and asthma. Medical endorsements and images of physicians appeared regularly in these campaigns because the health risks of tobacco weren't established yet. Smoking was marketed as modern, healthful, and sophisticated, which reinforced its massive popularity across Western societies. It took decades before the link to cancer became undeniable, and medical organizations finally condemned the claims as dangerously deceptive. Until then, doctors genuinely recommended cigarettes to patients, which is perhaps the most successful example of terrible medical advice ever given with complete confidence. Cocaine was sold over the counter in the late 1800s as a cure for hay fever, toothaches, and general fatigue, and people genuinely thought it was safe. After cocaine was isolated from coca leaves in the 1850s, doctors embraced it as a local anesthetic and stimulant. Pharmaceutical companies produced drops and lozenges containing small amounts, advertising them as harmless and invigorating. Sigmund Freud wrote enthusiastically about its medical potential before anyone recognized the addiction risks. For a while, you could just buy cocaine at the pharmacy like it was cough syrup. Growing concerns about abuse in the early 1900s led to regulation and eventual prohibition in consumer medicines. But for a brief window, cocaine was just another wellness product. It's a reminder that doctor recommended doesn't always mean what you think it means. Deliberately infecting people with malaria to cure syphilis sounds like something from a horror story, but it won a Nobel Prize in 1927. Austrian physician Julius Wagner pioneered malarial therapy for treating neurosyphilis by intentionally giving patients malaria parasites. The resulting high fevers would weaken or destroy the syphilis bacteria, and once that was done, the malaria itself was treated with quinine. This was risky, obviously, but it actually worked often enough to become a recognized medical treatment. Wagner-Joreg's Nobel Prize confirmed it as legitimate medicine, at least until antibiotics arrived and made the whole terrifying process obsolete. It's one of the stranger moments in medical history where the cure genuinely seemed worse than the disease, but people took it anyway because the alternative was neurosyphilis. Animal droppings were a surprisingly popular ingredient in ancient medicine, which really makes you grateful for modern pharmacology. Egyptian, Greek, and Roman medical texts describe mixtures containing cow or goose dung applied to wounds or used in ointments. Healers believed the material had cooling or healing properties that could reduce inflammation or fight infection, which is optimistic to say the least. Dung-based preparations continued into medieval times, sometimes mixed with honey or herbs to make them slightly less revolting. These treatments reflected early medicine's reliance on observation and symbolism rather than actual understanding of how infection works. If it came from nature and seemed like it might help, it went into the medicine. Hygiene was clearly not a top priority. Morphine became so popular in the 19th century that Victorians called it God's own medicine, which should tell you how enthusiastically it was prescribed. Friedrich Turner isolated it from opium in the early 1800s, and physicians immediately started using it for everything from surgery and war injuries to coughs and menstrual pain. Administered as a tincture or injection, it provided powerful pain relief that genuinely seemed miraculous compared to previous options. The problem, predictably, was that widespread use led to massive dependency among soldiers and civilians, especially after the American Civil War. Its addictive nature eventually became impossible to ignore, spurring the development of safer alternatives. For a while, though, morphine was just the default answer to pain, and nobody questioned whether handing it out so freely might cause issues down the line. A rock in 7th century Ireland became a pilgrimage site for people with hemorrhoids because apparently divine intervention was the only option left. Saint Fiacre, the patron saint of gardeners and sufferers of anal ailments, supposedly cured himself by sitting on a particular stone near his hermitage. Pilgrims decided to try the same approach, traveling to sit on the rock in hopes of miraculous healing. Over the centuries, the stone gained a reputation for curing what became known as Fiacre's disease, and people kept visiting it well into modern times. It's a perfect blend of Christian faith and local folk healing, where the solution to a painful medical problem was simply sitting on the same rock a saint once used. The fact that this ritual persisted for so long suggests that either it worked through sheer belief or people were just really desperate for any solution at all. If you thought any of that was bad, just remember that in 100 years, people will probably be looking back at our current medical practices with exactly the same horror. So which of these historical treatments do you think was the absolute worst? Let us know in the comments below, and if you've got any other bizarre medical stories we missed, we'd love to hear those too. Until next time, stay unhinged.